General Hospital spoilers reveal that a devastating new chapter is beginning to unfold in Port Charles, one born not from love or loyalty, but from obsession, grief, and the unchecked arrogance of scientific ambition. The long-whispered rumors of Britt Westbourne's return, rumors that once seemed impossible, are now erupting into reality. But the truth behind this resurrection is more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Britt is indeed coming back, but she is not truly Britt. She is something else. Something unnatural. A meticulously engineered clone, crafted from strands of genetic desperation and molded by the cold hands of Victor Cassadine. Manipulated by the scientific genius and moral detachment of Professor Hank Dalton, and enabled by the broken heart of Liesl Albrecht. This revelation, initially hidden in the deepest shadows of Cassadine's secrecy, is now poised to rip apart every emotional and ethical boundary that still exists in Port Charles. Liesl, once a brilliant and fiercely principled doctor, was driven to the edge of sanity after the death of her daughter. Her grief was unbearable, consuming every ounce of rationality, leaving behind only a singular obsession, to see Britt again. When Victor approached her in secret, whispering of new experimental procedures, of medical breakthroughs buried by politics and fear, Liesl didn't hesitate. She joined him. She ignored every moral instinct she once held and stepped into a world of quiet laboratories, forbidden research, and whispered promises that death no longer needed to be permanent. What emerged from that dark alliance was not a miracle, it was a mistake. A clone. A perfect replica of Britt in every physical way. Her eyes, her voice, her gestures, all carefully programmed through neural mimicry and memory sequencing. Dalton, whose reputation had long been stained by rumors of unethical trials and genetic manipulation, had been waiting for a project like this. With Victor funding the work and Liesl providing the necessary DNA samples and behavioral archives, the clone was born in secret, grown in chambers, programmed with carefully curated emotional simulations, and given every trait that once made Britt beloved. But there was one thing they couldn't reproduce, the soul. Liesl, at first, was convinced. She saw her daughter again. She heard her voice, felt her embrace, listened to her laugh. For a fleeting moment, the pain subsided. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. The clone's reactions were slightly off. Her memory incomplete. Her instincts not quite aligned with who Britt truly was. And yet, Liesl couldn't let go. The fantasy had become too powerful. Too real. She saw no problem. For him, the clone was never about healing Liesl, it was about proving what was possible. It was about control, about legacy, about conquering mortality itself. With Dalton, he had built a machine in human skin. A puppet with a heartbeat. And now, with the clone nearing public readiness, Victor prepared to unveil his creation, not just to Britt's grieving loved ones, but to the world. The plan was simple and devastating: return the clone to Port Charles, let her reclaim Britt's life, and in doing so, sow confusion, dependency, and ultimately dominance. But the return is anything but smooth. From the moment the clone steps foot back in town, everything begins to fracture. The people who loved Britt, Terry, Elizabeth, Carly, Jason, should he return, even Liesl herself, feel the dissonance immediately. They want to believe. They want to rejoice. But something is wrong. The way she smiles is slightly too calculated. The way she hesitates before recalling key memories. The way she reacts to old jokes or shared secrets. Britt's essence is missing. And it terrifies them. What should be a joyous miracle becomes a creeping horror. And for Liesl, the guilt begins to fester. She watches as the clone interacts with others, imitating a daughter she once held, but who is now truly gone. The people around her start to question everything. Was Britt's disease real? Did she ever die? What has Liesl done? Her silence becomes a scream. Her grief, once shared, becomes suspicion. And all the while, Victor watches from afar, satisfied that chaos has finally begun to unfold exactly as he intended. The clone, unaware of her origins, begins to develop independent thoughts. This new Britt begins asking questions about her memories, about inconsistencies, about strange moments she can't explain. She feels emotion, but it is programmed. She remembers, but only what she was given. She begins to break down, not physically, but existentially. She senses the difference between herself and those around her. She feels isolated. She lashes out. And in those outbursts, the mask begins to slip. People begin to suspect the unthinkable. And when the truth is revealed, that this Britt is not the real Britt at all, but a product of cloning, Port Charles is thrown into unprecedented turmoil. Carly demands justice. Elizabeth weeps for her friend all over again. Jason, if present, is enraged, knowing he never had the chance to say goodbye to the real Britt. Liesl is publicly shamed, called out for playing God, for betraying her daughter's memory. Dalton disappears, vanishing into the scientific underground to avoid prosecution. And Victor, if still alive, is hunted, yet again proving he is the architect of destruction on both personal and global scales. But the true devastation lies with the clone herself. Now aware of what she is, she exists in a purgatory of identity. Not fully Britt, not fully artificial. She begs Liesl for answers, for purpose, for meaning. Liesl cannot answer her. She created this version of Britt out of love, but now she must live with the knowledge that she gave life to something that cannot truly live. And as the clone spirals deeper into an identity crisis, she begins to ask the question no one can answer: does she have the right to exist? Port Charles reels. The moral implications ripple across every institution: GH, the WSB, the Cassadine estate, the legal system. Laws are not equipped to handle a human who isn't legally born but was artificially created. The public is divided. Some call the clone a miracle of science. Others call her an abomination. She becomes both symbol and scapegoat. And all the while, Liesl watches, knowing that her grief, once private and sacred, has become a global controversy. The final question remains: what now? The clone cannot simply disappear. She is sentient, confused, emotionally unstable, but alive. Does she remain in Port Charles? Is she granted autonomy? Or is she shut away, destroyed, erased like a failed experiment? No answer satisfies everyone. And so, the city remains suspended in moral limbo, haunted not just by the ghost of Britt Westbourne, but by the living echo that continues to walk her path. This is no longer a story of resurrection. It is a story of consequence, of what happens when grief becomes obsession. And when science is weaponized by power-hungry men like Victor and morally broken hearts like Liesl. The return of Britt is no return at all. It is the beginning of a new nightmare. One that promises to stretch far beyond the corridors of General Hospital, and into the soul of every person who dares to love again in a world where not even death is final. The moment the new Britt appeared in Port Charles, everything changed, not in triumph or in tearful reunion, but in a cascade of quiet horror that began to spread like poison through the hearts of those who once loved her. She had Britt's face, her voice, her movements. She occupied the same space. But she was not Britt. She was the product of manipulation, science without soul, and worst of all, memory without meaning. There were no flickers of emotion when she saw familiar faces. No warmth in her gaze. No recognition of places filled with laughter and pain. She was a perfect shell, a living echo, and within her, nothing. No past, no grief, no joy. Just the blank programming of a mind artificially constructed. For Jason Morgan, it was nothing short of psychological torment. Jason had grieved Britt in silence. In darkness. Theirs had been a complicated, fragile connection, built in stolen moments, bathed in danger, and cut short by death. Her loss was one of the few that pierced through his iron resolve. And now, as he stood in front of her again, staring into eyes that looked like Britt's but held no trace of her essence, he felt something inside him crack. This wasn't resurrection. It was desecration. A brutal rewrite of something sacred. The woman before him didn't flinch when he whispered her name. She didn't recall the times they had shared, the risks they had taken, or the bond they had formed on the run. There was no memory of love. No trace of the woman who had made him feel human in a world that had taught him to be a weapon. The new Britt functioned flawlessly. She spoke in clear, measured tones. She performed medical tasks with stunning precision. But it was all mechanical, detached, calculated. When she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. When she touched others, it was with clinical indifference. She was a machine in every sense of the word. And her inability to feel or remember became the catalyst for Jason's new obsession. At first, he tried to deny it. He told himself it was just a coincidence, a cruel trick. But over time, he saw her moving through GH's halls, wearing the name of the woman he lost, and his grip on reality began to shift. Each encounter pulled him deeper into a spiral of confusion and rage. He began questioning everything, what it meant to grieve, what it meant to love, and whether what he was seeing was a miracle or a nightmare. The more he tried to distance himself from her, the more he felt pulled into the void she represented. It wasn't just the absence of memory that haunted him. It was the illusion of presence. The idea that someone could look so much like Britt, could wear her body and voice like a costume, and yet be entirely hollow inside. It was a violation of memory, a twisted parody of love. And it drove him to the edge of madness. As Jason's obsession deepened, others began to notice the fracture. He was colder, more distant. His actions became erratic. He visited the lab at all hours, demanding answers. He confronted Liesl with a fury she had never seen, accusing her of robbing Britt of her dignity. But Liesl, worn down by guilt and grief, had no defense. She could not undo what had been done. She had wanted her daughter back so desperately that she was willing to accept a clone without a soul. Now she could only watch as the people around her unraveled under the weight of what she had helped create. Victor's control over the situation remained absolute. Every aspect of the clone's development had been calculated, including her lack of emotional memory. He didn't want a resurrected Britt, he wanted a programmable tool. A weapon in white scrubs. Her identity had been wiped clean, not by accident, but by design. And now, with her integrated into Port Charles society, he had what he wanted, a symbol of his power to rewrite life. To bend reality. Her presence alone was psychological warfare. The ripple effects were staggering. General Hospital's board faced scrutiny. Legal scholars argued over whether she had rights. Friends of the real Britt began protesting, demanding she be removed, decommissioned, erased. But others, those who saw her utility, defended her presence. Chaos bloomed in every corner of the city. And through it all, Jason remained fixated on one question: what had they done to Britt? He began returning to old haunts. The hospital wing where they first bonded. The bench where they shared coffee and cautious hope. Each place was haunted now. Not by ghosts, but by the living specter of a woman who should not exist. His nights became sleepless. His mind looped endlessly through memories that no longer had a home. The clone had no memory of him, but he remembered everything. And that imbalance broke something inside him. Jason began spiraling into a silent war with himself. He tried to find flaws in the clone, some technical vulnerability that would prove she was not Britt, that would justify his horror. But the more he looked, the more perfect she seemed. And that perfection became its own kind of madness. Because how could something be so flawless and yet so utterly wrong? He stopped seeing her as a person. She became a symptom. A representation of everything that had gone wrong in his life. A constant reminder that even death could be manipulated. That not even grief was sacred. And it wasn't just Jason. Others began to crumble under the weight of this new reality. Britt's friends, once holding on to hope, now felt betrayal. Carly avoided the clone entirely. Maxie couldn't look her in the eyes. Even Liesl began to withdraw. Her initial joy fading into horror as she realized that the price of resurrection was psychological annihilation. The clone, sensing the rejection, didn't understand why. She had been programmed to help. To serve. To be Britt. But every action she took only deepened the void. She began asking questions. Why did people look at her with pain? Why did Jason avoid her? Why did her name evoke sorrow? She began to malfunction, not mechanically, but emotionally. Cracks appeared in her performance. Glitches in behavior. Confusion, frustration. Even moments of violent reaction. And with each misstep, Jason's obsession grew more dangerous. He no longer saw her as a mistake. He saw her as a threat. To Britt's memory. To his sanity. To everything he had left. And still, Victor watched from the shadows, pleased. His plan was unfolding perfectly. Liesl's guilt. Jason's collapse. Port Charles divided. The clone was more than a scientific marvel, she was an agent of emotional destruction. A new era of psychological warfare had begun, and it wore the face of the dead. The obsession was complete. Not just for Jason, but for everyone. The city could not move forward. The past, distorted and reanimated, walked among them. Britt was gone. But her ghost lived on in the form of a woman who bore her name and face, but none of her light. And as the walls of morality collapsed, and as sanity began to fracture, one truth became clear. The return of Britt had not saved anyone. It had destroyed everything. A terrifying new chapter is now unfolding in Port Charles as the alliance between Liesl Albrecht and Victor Cassadine takes a darker, more aggressive turn. No longer confined to whispered experiments and covert science, their twisted partnership has evolved into a fully realized operation, a calculated campaign of psychological and strategic warfare. Together, they are no longer acting out of grief or desperation, but with intention. What began as a secret resurrection has now spiraled into a full-scale offensive. And at the center of this brewing storm stands the newly manufactured version of Britt Westbourne, a synthetic figure no longer just a passive clone, but a weaponized creation molded for control, disruption, and influence. The Britt the world once knew is gone, and in her place stands something colder, stronger, and far more dangerous. Under Victor's guidance and Liesl's fractured maternal devotion, this clone has been reprogrammed not just to imitate life, but to manipulate it. Her lack of memory, once considered a flaw, has now become a strategic advantage. Without the burdens of emotion, without the weight of relationships or conscience, she becomes an unflinching instrument capable of executing calculated plans. Her presence in Port Charles is no longer simply a moral dilemma, it's an act of psychological infiltration. She has begun integrating herself into institutions. Rebuilding a version of Britt's professional life, but behind every interaction lies an unseen directive. Each conversation, each smile, each step is monitored and guided by Victor's designs. And Liesl, though once consumed by grief, is no longer the broken woman seeking closure. She has crossed a line. Her guilt has mutated into something else, loyalty to a vision, belief in a cause. In her mind, this new Britt is not a betrayal of the past but an evolution of it. She has helped create something that defies death, something that challenges the very rules of nature. And now she intends to protect that creation at all costs. Her alliance with Victor is sealed not just by loss, but by purpose. Together, they are preparing for something massive, a tactical strike on the emotional core of Port Charles. They are no longer mourning. They are attacking. Jason Morgan, meanwhile, has become the first and most critical target of this new agenda. His emotional entanglement with the real Britt, his internal unraveling since the clone's arrival, and his deep connections to Port Charles' power structures make him both vulnerable and dangerous. Liesl and Victor know that if anyone can see through the illusion, it is Jason. But more than that, They understand that destabilizing him is the key to destabilizing everything. By pushing Jason to his psychological limit, they can weaken the city's strongest pillar of protection, and so the war against him begins. At first, it's subtle. The clone appears where Jason least expects her. She begins speaking with familiar cadences. She mimics mannerisms with eerie accuracy. She shows up at GH at the same time he does. At Kelly's. At the Metro Court. Always watching, always near. But there's no love in her eyes, only programmed interest. Jason, already struggling with the trauma of her presence, begins to lose his grip on reason. He isolates himself. Pushes away allies. His world begins to fracture, and it is no accident. It is design. Then the attacks escalate. Data is leaked. Jason is implicated in false hospital security breaches. WSB agents receive anonymous tips about his involvement with illegal tech at GH. Data files trace back to Britt's badge, yet Jason's name is attached. He's called in for questioning. Surveillance footage is edited. Public doubt grows. Friends begin to waver. And through it all, the clone remains silent, precise. Positioned like a puppet whose strings are being pulled by Victor and Liesl from afar. But it doesn't stop at deception. As Victor's plan accelerates, physical danger enters the equation. Lab samples are altered. Explosive prototypes are stored inside GH under false credentials. A major data crash nearly compromises the hospital's core systems, and Jason is framed as the saboteur. His every move is monitored, twisted, manipulated. Liesl, fully immersed in Victor's vision, no longer sees Jason as a man mourning her daughter, but as an obstacle threatening her new beginning, an enemy of the evolution she helped create. Jason, driven by instincts that won't let him ignore the truth, starts his own investigation. He retraces the clone's origin. He finds inconsistencies in medical records, signs of altered DNA sequencing, unregistered activity in GH's experimental wing. He contacts Damian Spinelli, who confirms the existence of a ghost network connected to a Cassadine server. But with each step closer to the truth, Jason finds himself further isolated. Carly urges him to stop. Sonny warns him about drawing attention. But Jason can't. Because he knows. What has returned is not Britt. What now walks among them is a lie built by grief and ambition. And it has become the front line of a larger, more terrifying plan. The clone, meanwhile, begins to evolve. Exposure to real emotion, to confusion, to rejection. Begins to create anomalies in her programming. She starts acting unpredictably. Lashing out. Demanding answers from Liesl. Her conditioning begins to weaken. She doesn't understand why people look at her with sadness, with fear. She wants to be accepted, but also resents the pain she causes. She is caught between code and consciousness. And in that imbalance, she becomes even more volatile. Victor sees this instability and accelerates the timetable. He instructs Liesl to prepare for a final phase, an event that will tear down what remains of Jason's credibility and solidify their control over GH and its research divisions. The plan is audacious. Frame Jason for a medical disaster, use Britt's identity to manipulate legal channels, and force Port Charles to accept the new order. But Jason, though isolated, is not defeated. His instincts sharpen. His rage focuses. He gathers allies in secret. He prepares not for justice, but for war. What lies ahead is no longer just a struggle for truth, it is a battle for the soul of the city. The return of Britt has become the catalyst for a reinvention of control, fear, and manipulation. Liesl and Victor, bound by trauma and ambition, have transformed grief into a weapon. And Jason, caught between memory and menace, must fight not only to preserve Britt's legacy, but to prevent the city from falling under the control of those who dared to rewrite death itself. The battlefield is psychological. The tools are memory, illusion, and scientific terror. And as the city sleeps, unaware of the war unfolding around them, one truth is certain: this time, Jason is not just fighting ghosts. He's fighting what they've become. And the cost of failure will be more than loss. It will be total collapse.